Hi, welcome everyone, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Ivars Šteinbergs, who is a researcher at the Institute of Literature, Folklore and Art of the University of Latvia, and also a lecturer at the Latvian Academy of Culture. He studied comparative literature in the United States and earned his master's in comparative literature at the State University of New York at Binghamton in 2018. And since then, he did his PhD, which he recently completed. And he's also a poet, a translator and a critic, and has 2 published volumes of poetry. And I'm very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Professor. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see and hear me well enough. I will just be sharing my screen. If there's any problem with the technicalities, please let me know. I will try to see to them. I am grateful to Professor Pink for inviting me to be part of this project. As was said, I am a poet and translator myself, but have recently received my PhD in cultural theory, and my research interests do align with what I do creatively. Namely, for the last few years, I've been engaged in studying literary translation with the idea of combining the philosophy of translation with the history of Latvian poetry translation, as it can be looked at through the prism of colonial studies, which means in the case of Latvian poetry, Baltic colonialism, Baltic post-colonialism. And therefore, this presentation is also devoted to exploring some of the questions I've been asking about writing translations in the Latvian language, both in the past and today. My talk is based on 3 papers, one of which is already published. One of them is in the process of being peer-reviewed, and one is research I'm currently working on. It's a work in progress. I will begin by outlining the context of poetry translation in the last decades of the Soviet Republic of Latvia, illustrating both the general trends, and I will also talk about how certain translators used poetry translation perhaps as a tool of resisting Soviet coloniality. As you know, Latvia did spend the later part of the 20th century under Soviet occupation. And I'm doing this because it is my conviction that without reassessing this past, it is somehow much more difficult to be cognizant of today's situation. And in the final part of my presentation, I'll move on to the issue that's on my mind in the last few months, meaning what has happened after Latvia regained independence in 1990 and 1991, and what is happening now in the 21st century. Have things changed in the last few years, perhaps illustrating some general change over 3 decades? Have certain trends vanished? Have certain trends remained the same, continuing to haunt the production of translations like unwanted heritage? And you will find that I'm interested in asking not just how translators translate, which is also interesting to me at times, but also today I want to emphasize who is being translated and how much. But before I begin, I want to share a brief comment about the subtitle of my talk, It is, of course, a somewhat hastily chosen string of keywords that circulate what I'm writing, but I do promise that I will try to touch upon the concepts I mentioned. So, first of all, decoloniality is, of course, vital, I think, to formulating arguments about Latvia's literary processes. And this goes for my presentation as well. Because my observation is that certain poets and translators in the late 20th century, working in the context of the Soviet regime, found ways to write translations as a kind of linguistic decolonization. Whereas the poets working in the independence era have in fact perhaps something to learn from the ones who worked in conditions of occupation. In other words, I do believe there's much decolonization still to be done. Whereas the second term, global modernism, it might be confusing, and I understand it might be problematic, but the intended meaning, what I meant was actually quite simple. I mean the historical avant-garde in translation. So as you probably know, the avant-garde in various forms is a persistent phenomena, and there are different ruptures of tradition that continue to occur across time and geography. And I'm here mainly speaking about avant-garde practices outside of the West and after 1945. However, in many of these cases, these practices rarely become translated globally outside of the frame of their immediate occurrence. But the so-called historical avant-garde, the Dadaists, the Surrealists, the Futurists, the Expressionists, they've been widely translated and therefore present an interesting example of how modernism becomes world literature. And so how the supposedly global circulates in local contexts. And I mention this because I will once or twice touch upon surrealists or Dadaists and their texts as instances when a piece of what sometimes is called the Western literary canon, how it becomes through Latvian translation an active participant in the literary context of an Eastern European country in the late 20th century. And finally, the pitfalls of representation is an attempt to poetically scrutinize what translation is often made out to be, that translation is something that represents something, the author's vision, or more generally, the culture of the source language. Or if we look at many translations across time and consider factors outside of the actual texts, the implication is that it represents, let's say, the world, or it represents the West, the East, the tradition. In short, some kind of other and its otherness. And of course, as I think many of us, there's much to be doubted in the notion of representation, because it usually also implies impartiality, objectivity, faithfulness, and so on. Yet, as we all, I'm sure, very well know, this is never really the case in literary translation, because both on a micro level and on the macro level, translation is necessarily selective and impartial. But I choose to talk about this because this is not the kind of thinking that was shaping the common understanding of what translation does in modern day Latvia. But okay, so to get to modern day Latvia, I would like to first start by discussing poetry translation within Soviet contexts, which is a politicized space, the politicized space of the Soviet Union as a whole, entailed literary translation as an ambivalent, even paradoxical place in the overall literary system, because literary translation in the Soviet space oscillated between demonstrating the other and silencing its otherness. Translation was a tool for indoctrination, as it was censored, controlled, and publishing was streamlined to strengthen communism or disparage capitalism. However, since the translations being published were usually somewhat less regulated than original works, this created the opportunity for translators to get relative relief from being monitored and turn to ambitions that they could not realize otherwise. This was the case also for Latvian translators, the study of whose work I think is especially relevant now, considering how imperial nostalgia persists and keeps shaping constitutional change in 21st century Russia, which is a force proven to be a threat to European democracy and at times human life. And as I already mentioned, understanding this common past, I believe will allow us to have a clearer view of the dangers we face now, if not in the front lines, then on paper at least. And also, I base my observations on the theoretical framework developed in recent years, established by scholars, Soviet scholars, who framed the Soviet regime as imperial and therefore colonial. And the term that many have found useful to denote the specifics of this imperial power's historical behavior is coloniality as opposed to colonialism, meaning that the structure was not explicitly an empire with colonies, but it did, however, implement strategies of oppression and supervision that are analogous to those of colonialism. In the case of Soviet power in Latvia, this included, as was the case in many republics, censorship, Russification, social and other kinds of repressions. And not unimportantly to my story today, it included restraints on expressions of national or ethnic specificity. An example of which would be linguistic experimentation or the celebration of linguistic diversity. The notion of Soviet coloniality has recently gained traction outside the former Soviet republics, as Western academics echo the work done by local scholars. An example is what you see on the screen. This is William Pratlett's and Herbert Cooper's book, The Post-Soviet and Post-Colonial. But in the case of local scholars in the Baltic countries, much has already been said and done about thinking about the relationships between the occupied territories and their oppressor, be it the writing of Annus in Estonia, Benedict Kalniņš in Latvia, Violet Kellerts in Lithuania, amongst several others. However, when thinking about Soviet translation as it relates to coloniality, theoretical reflection is sparse, although very engaging. The Soviet Empire did much to ensure that its literary production, at least the part that's in line with accepted ideology, was widely disseminated across occupied territories, and conversely, it also endeavored to make sure that the Russian language becomes the locus wherein world literature is being built. This process is rife with inequalities to begin with, but it's also even more skewed by authoritarian approaches, where, as Natalia Rudnitska explains, I quote, due to a policy of exclusions and admissions, the world literature canon was represented as a single entity spreading universal and ideologically appropriate ideas, values, and aesthetics, with Russian literature being its most important part. And she goes on to say that for non-Soviet authors who got to be admitted to the canon, this often meant legitimized appropriation. End of quoting. And the phrase she uses, legitimized appropriation, I think is uh, very apt because it can be understood both poetically and politically. So on the one hand, unwelcome ideas are concealed, and on the other, linguistic experimentation is washed away. Although in the larger scheme of Soviet translation, this sometimes also happened because of the qualification of translators. For example, as Natalia Kamovnikova notes, I quote, a literary translator in the Soviet Union was permitted to remain monolingual, as contradictory to the professional requirements as that may sound, end of quote. So the translations were commonly written using either bridge languages or so-called interlinear trots, so literal word-for-word translations done by someone who did know the language but did not work as a translator, therefore adding more confusion to the already biased landscape. So the context, it's a field of multiple tensions, not in the least between xenophobia and internationalism. So James Bayer asserts that on the one hand, Soviet Russia promoted translation of world literature into Russian, and on the other hand, implemented censorship on nearly every level of the publishing process. And this applied to culture in Soviet Latvia as well. We strived for diversity by introducing the other, and we let the regime suppress the otherness that could supposedly threaten the matrix of power. And so on the outside, officially, the regime was supposed to create a multinational community where different friendly republics would translate each other's work, as well as the canonical classics. However, all of it was still very much under scrutiny. Therefore, I describe it as a coloniality that is always already internally contradictory. It allows and forbids at the same time, thus creating a kind of loophole in cultural politics through which translators and poets saw an opportunity to go beyond isolation. They saw an opportunity to carry in non-Soviet alternatives to the state-controlled publications, and this is part of what made Latvian translation after the Stalin era, especially in the late 1960s throughout the 80s, stand out on the backdrop of Russian translation. Latvian authors following such figures as Knuts Skujinieks began to actively learn foreign languages and work directly with the source material. This is something very strongly defended by Skujinieks. Second, writers and poets became more aware of the partiality of the literature being translated into Latvian. Skujinieks, again, a polyglot translator, and perhaps the most talented Latvian translators of foreign poetry. He talked about the merits, the treasures, the prizes translation can give to a language. And in his case, this also included translating more women poets. So in 1970, he writes that self-awareness of national culture, understanding of your sources and course is impossible without comparison with other cultures. And this is, of course, to be done through translating. He's considered a powerhouse of poetry translation because he knew how to create artistically excellent and formally masterful renderings of such complex authors as Federico Garcia Lorca But he's also one of the first major translators of Gabriela Mistral, as well as the most highly regarded translators of European folk songs. Now, he did not openly translate banned authors, and he did not actively participate in dissidentism, even though he was accused of it. But his translations nevertheless inspired his contemporaries, and they continue to speak to writers even decades after publication. Which is because, and that is because his translations, himself and his followers, they had a sensibility that valued national linguistic specificity and tried to envision a more inclusive panorama of world literature. So one of the followers of Šteinbergs, one of his contemporaries, was the linguistic prodigy Uldis Bērziņš, also a polyglot translator and a phenomenal modernist poet in his own right. And his translations are a fine example, at least in my interpretation, of resisting Soviet tendencies, Soviet oppression in two aspects. First, the choice of authors, and second, the poetics of the translations themselves. And it is within Bērziņš translations that I find a strong decolonizing movement. First, he specialized in Persian and Turkic languages, basing his studies on an understanding of cultural relations. A scholar of Bērziņš, Marians Rigis, writes that during the army, when he was in the army, Bērziņš decided to study Turkish because he believed that Turkey is in the middle between Europe and Asia, and that there we may find the synthesis of East and West. This was Rigis' quote. And this means that from the outset, Bērziņš had been keen on cultivating a global outlook that could be injected into Latvian culture through translations. For him, translations seem to function not only as a bridge between Latvian and Turkish readers, like a one-way bridge, but as a gateway to an overview of Eastern-Western confluence, and as many roads opened in many directions. And this included translating modernist free verse authors who were considered either decadent or considered inappropriate for socialist realism in the 1960s. Similarly, there's one example of translating a Russian poet, even though translating Russian literature was not a priority for Bērziņš, because he was much more preoccupied with the so-called smaller languages. But he did nevertheless publish one bilingual collection of poems by Russian modernist Velimir Khlebnikov. And this was at the time one of the very rare occasions of publishing the futurism that had been written before the Soviet Union. Another case of modernist aesthetics coming into the context. But second, as for the poetics of the translations themselves, Bērziņš wrote his translations in a way that purposefully enriched Latvian vocabulary in a time when cultural specificity suffered under Soviet coloniality. And this goes for most of what Bērziņš wrote. Also, his translations that I see as examples of creative writing, or at least creative transformations of originals. They can, I think, be viewed as a kind of original poem, as a kind of original poems that have relationships with foreign texts. And thus, also in the case of Khlebnikov, challenge the concept of the original itself. But the example I want to show you today is a translation from English. It's a poem called Patterson by the poet Allen Ginsberg, published in 1980. I mean, the translation is published in 1980. Ginsberg's poem in Latvian translation is a case where if it were an original Latvian composition and not a translation, it would be less likely to be published, seeing as it describes a decadent body that masturbates, is covered with fluids, a scene that would probably be poorly tolerated by censors. Bērziņš recreates Ginsberg's verse creatively while sticking close to the images and the rhythm of each line. For example, there's a rhyming line that says hire and fire and make and break and fart, and he translates it as īrēt, fīrēt, šaustīt, taustīt, kost un ost un bezdēt. But what I find most striking in his translation is that it works intimately with linguistic material in the target language, bringing forth creative word formations that are intimately entwined with Latvian. So his translation allows for the translated poem to be read as a literary product in its own right, because many of the words, you see them highlighted here, like dolārs tapetēm piesapņotajās glāžbūros, gaidkambaros, nīdesamība, and so on. They are all newly invented words or neologisms that are not, in fact, neologisms in the original, but in the translation, nevertheless, seem in the least poetic. At least they seem poetic, if we do not want to say fitting. And so I think the creativity of Bērziņš can also be read as a critique of the idea of linguistic possession. Like one of the ways Soviet coloniality expressed itself was by declaring ownership of the Latvian language and imposing rules, regulations, grammar and different limitations. Then Bērziņš creativity demonstrates that language is not or cannot really be owned on a deeper, more philosophical level. This is because for that to be true, there must be a natural correspondence between signifier and signified, which is shown to be untrue by any visible creativity in a translation that we nevertheless consider legitimate. One more example, which demonstrates the resonance of the modernist poetry and the avant-garde poetry in translation, is the anthology of modern French texts compiled by Maya Silmale a decade earlier, before Bērziņš translation came out. Now, as far as translated poetry books go, this might be the only case in the 1970s when Latvian readers in Latvia had a chance to legally read surrealist verse, like André Breton and other authors important in modernism, starting from Arthur Rimbaud to Blaise Cendrars and others. Scholar Eva Eglai-Kristsohne writes, as she analyzes the arrival of Western literature behind the Iron Curtain, she writes that, I quote, "It shows the conflict between rules from above and initiatives from below." And she's referring specifically to this collection of poetry. The collection of poetry was perceived as a breath of fresh air by readers and poets alike. And the resonance, interestingly, the resonance of this one volume, this one book, continues today, because there are several contemporary Latvian poets who've referenced texts from this book in the 21st century. But this also included people writing during the Soviet era, showing the introduction of modernist poets to the local intellectual creative landscape. It did create a kind of sporadic modernism in Latvia. It was almost a kind of contraband that created small pockets of aesthetics that resisted socialist realism. However, at the time of publication, there was resonance also from the side of the censors, who belatedly perceived it as a dangerous mistake that should be punished. And so there's an editorial review of the publishing house Liesma in 1970 that talks about how Silmala's introduction disorients the reader, and that the head of the editorial office should be reprimanded by the order of the press committee for all the ideological mistakes made in the collection and so on. This introduction they speak about, which disorients readers, it's one of the very few texts published in in the 70s that contextualizes modernist poetry without being soaked in Leninist ideology. It's one of the few times we were able to talk about literary avant-garde and surrealism without calling it the bourgeois decadence of rotting capitalism and so on. And Silmala's case is also an example of repression. She was observed throughout her life and previously had been arrested and unjustly sentenced to 10 years of correctional labor in a colony for participating in a reading group where they read French authors. But of course, Silmala Bērziņš and the handful of talented translators, they are more of the exception in this period, as mostly Latvian culture in this period, as it manifests itself in translation processes, it is state-controlled, aimed at a wide audience, and it is Russocentric and androcentric. And in terms of the selection of authors, it's linguistically and territorially Eurocentric. So the translation overall, the translation processes overall at this time, it privileges a certain type of individual that in a way suppresses, therefore, everything that is implicitly or explicitly undesirable to the hegemon. This includes patriarchal the norms. The hegemon is obviously patriarchal. I'll give you two examples. At the time, and this is where I turn to who is being and how much is being translated. Russian is obviously the dominant language from which poems are translated. And this is, of course, related to an ongoing process of Russification. But in some part, thanks to Šteinbergs, during the time between the late 50s and 1990, the number of languages does double. It doubles in comparison to the Stalinist era. And so the range of the languages represented, it is wider. However, most of the titles published is still mostly Russian, with at least almost 80 titles published from this during the 60s and up to the 90s. So technically, more languages are being represented, but Russian remains far ahead in terms of titles. Furthermore, out of the 218 books that I've been looking at, of the 218 books of translated poetry between 57 and 91, so 3/4 are written by men, although the reality is that it's probably higher since the books in which collectives are printed, the majority is also men. So there are 167 books by men, 27 by women, and the rest are by collectives, where mostly it's translators, men translating men, authors who are men. And so this proportion in itself is not surprising, but the statistics does allow to demonstrate how certain unequal practices, strengthened socially or politically, become taken for granted and then manifest and spread in cultural spheres, including translated literature. So these two examples, gender and titles published in language variety, how does that translate to the 90s or the 21st century? At this time, I would like to turn to the data about the independence period and emphasize the 21st century. And share the questions I've been asking myself lately. So is the world represented in Latvian poetry in translation more inclusive? Has it become more inclusive? Have translators inherited either the creativity of Bērziņš, the wide panoramic view of Šteinbergs, and so on, and ultimately what kind of decolonization would be needed in modern day Latvian poetry translation? So on the one hand, there's been a visible increase in interest towards modernist authors. If we keep with the historical avant-garde as an example, the 1990s did see the publication of a selection of Dadaist poetry called For Anna Bloom, translated by Johanna, as well as there were several culturally significant translations of expressionist, surrealist, futurist texts printed in periodicals, Grāmata, Avots, Kentaurs, and others. And so readers were introduced to different poetic schools that were previously only discussed in these derogatory terms, only discussed, if they were ever discussed, they were only discussed as these capitalists, the decadence of rotting capitalism and so on, which is on many cases very ironic, especially considering the politics of several of the avant-garde writers. And so many of the writers who grew up in the 90s, they do remember this period as a time of rapid exploration and a collective attempt to catch up with the rest of the world and read what Latvia's missed. But even so, the optimism about the 1990s starts to deflate when doing even a preliminary scan of the books of translated poetry after the 90s in the 21st century, because it hints towards the idea that general translation trends change much slower than ideological reorientation takes place. Now, I do want to note that this is data that's incomplete. The research is ongoing, but this preliminary research, it does nevertheless give some idea as to the range of languages, for example. It does suggest that the range has in fact become less diverse, and also surprisingly that Russian is still the dominant source language even in the 20th century. Many people guessed and suspected that it's going to be English, but that is not what the preliminary data show. This is from a sample of 95 books of translated poetry published between 2004 and 2021. And 29 from this selection, this sample, are translated from Russian, which amounts to 30% of the sample. And the rest is divided between English with 11 titles, French, Estonian, and approximately 10 other languages, with few of them surpassing 5 titles. And similarly, if we look at the identities of the authors that are being translated, again, for example, the gender disbalance, the situation also has not really changed that much. Here I looked at books published between the period of 2000 and 2021, during which time I found 168 books of translated poetry overall. And of these, there were 14 anthologies with different kinds of authors published from different kinds of places, which includes, anthologies of haikus or anthologies of a certain translator, anthologies of a certain nationality, and so on. But the remaining 154 books are collections of poems by a particular author, and of these, 117, or more than 75%, are books by men poets, and less than 25%, or one quarter, are books by women authors. Now, it should also be noted that a great deal of that 25%, that 24%, are books for the very youngest readers, for 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, like short poems in cardboard books and so on. Part of it is made up of local authors who happen to write in Russian and therefore are included in the statistics of translated poetry, even though they're considered local poets. And some of a part of that 24% is poets who published several books in a short period of time. Like there's actually one author, but statistically it's 3 books and so on. If we only look at what could be somewhat controversially called the artistic poetry from abroad, then it's definitely less than 20%. And it would include the poetry of Heli Laaksonen from Finland, Leelo Tungala, and then Galina Rimbu and Anna Akhmatova from who write in Russian, even though Galina Rimbu is now a Ukrainian poet. So obviously the conclusion here is not that women authors write less or write somehow in less interesting ways, but rather that the current publishing industry in Latvia also continues to favor men writers, and as such could be seen as an inheritor of Soviet tendencies. Now, obviously, this tendency would not be solely a Soviet problem, but it is the kind of connection that could be made based on the data. The percentage of books by women has increased, but the balance is very much still privileging the European male. So last remaining minutes. Yeah, it's my final slide as well. And so I believe that if we position this trend as a kind of ghost from the past, it can be seen in other ways as well. But if we do position it as a kind of ghost from the past, that is to say, if we conceptualize such issues as the momentum of Soviet coloniality, or an ontology that's become a hauntology, then it should become clear that the task of today's translators in Latvia is to become cognizant of new forms of decolonization, enact, envision, and realize new forms of decolonization. Forms that are very much concerned with who is being translated, who is being represented, and forms of decolonization that base its practice on feminist sensibility. As I conclude my presentation, I would like to share in brief closing remarks, closing thoughts that arise when witnessing what I had just called the momentum of Soviet coloniality. This is, of course, adding in a footnote that these are generalizations and do not obviously apply universally to every translator working in Latvia today. But first, I do find great value in this continuous rethinking of colonial histories, the reinterpretation of pasts, because it inevitably repositions our understanding of current events. The process of decolonizing the present is, amongst other things, made possible through defining the past as something that has never ended. It continues and is still part of today, oftentimes simply taking the shape of specters that haunt our aesthetic, cultural, or intellectual spheres, and that do so oftentimes unnoticed. And if we are not aware of its roots in real life material, in real experience that people had just 2 generations prior, I see danger in that. And therefore, second, the kind of decolonization I would love to see in Latvian translations, and the kind that it's happening and in different pockets across the scene, it does involve 2 aspects. One is the deliberate selection of texts that represent perspectives that go beyond the world of the spectre, beyond that which is androcentric, Eurocentric, or Russocentric. And just as importantly, the second part is the responsible and creative writing of translations, something that I did not find the time to include in my presentation, although it is still, in my opinion, very crucial. And we do have brilliant young translators working today who are inheriting ideas from Bērziņš and Šteinbergs and so on. The cultivation of linguistic specificity through translation has not lost its relevance, even though the oppressor who fought against it has officially been dismantled. And perhaps there is merit to the claims that the very liberation from the Soviet Union created a kind of relaxation that decelerated the textual creativity of the generations of translators who began working in post-independence, began working post the fall of the Soviet Union. At the same time as the extra textual practices strengthened by Soviet coloniality continued unacknowledged. Well, that's a long sentence, but I wrote that as my final sentence. Thank you very much for listening thus far. I will gladly discuss my presentation.
Thank you so much, Heinrich.
Ivars, thank you very much for your very. Do you hear me?
I do hear you. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Very interesting paper on this cultural, political specifics of translations into Latvian, and I would ask may make some comments and ask some questions. The statistics themselves that you showed us speak of the imperial disproportion of translations from Russian. And here I would like to ask again regarding the connotations of the languages from which they were translated into Latvian. These implications and hierarchies of languages and their literatures can be, I'm a Slavist, can be ideological, aesthetic, but also purely economic. In the Soviet Union, for example, a famous poet like Pasternak could translate Shakespeare, Goethe, and Georgian poets who are also highly valued. But the lesser known poets like, I don't know, Lipkin or Tarkovsky, only from Arabic, Persian, or the languages of Central Asia. Translations from Georgian were considered more valuable among poet translators than translations, for example, from Kazakh language. And this was expressed among other things in the payment for these translations. And it is clear that in addition to the connotations of languages and poetries in the official discourse, there were also unofficial connotations, a kind of dissident canon, a semi-dissident canon, and translating the disgraced Russian poet like Mandelstam, or you mentioned Velimir Khlebnikov, could be understood by the translators in Latvia as an act of resistance rather than self-russification, at least in their own legitimations. And the logic is this: if we are obliged to translate Russian, so much Russian from Russian, then it should be innovative and modernist. And you are speaking about this sporadic modernism. It's your term. This was the case, for example, in Poland too, or in the Eastern Germany, where, for example, the publishing house Volk und Welt translated and published Soviet avant-garde and non-conformist works that were outside the canon of Soviet literature. Was it the same? What was it like in Latvia? Your tables take into account official publications, but what about, for example, translation in samizdat, in Latvian samizdat?
Yes, thank you very much for your comments and the questions. One of the things that I think I should explain about the presentation is that I don't really talk so much about the actual social biographical context of the translators, because going more thoroughly into the history, it would definitely become relevant, meaning that there are different dynamics taking place at different times. For example, there are more samizdats at the end of the 80s. There are the first magazines. It's still during the Soviet era, but it's near the fall of the empire, that we have magazines publishing avant-garde authors and authors who are not fitting with the canon, authors you would get in trouble for translating it were you to publish it 10 years ago, right? So at the end of the 80s, yes, there's more samizdats, there's more, jeans and chewing gum, so people did circulate texts more often at the very before the fall of the Soviet Union. Whereas, let's say in the 70s, when the literature did start to kind of open up more, as opposed to the early 60s, late 50s, there were still many instances when, if you were not careful, there were historically documented oppression. People were reprimanded, they lost their jobs. Even famous, well-established superstar poets. We have a poet by the name of Imants Ziedonis, and you talked about how some regions or some authors are more important and more privileged when they become translated, or in terms of whether they should be translated and so on. Now, Imants Ziedonis, he was accepted by the nomenclature, he was accepted by the power, and so in a sense he could kind of decide what he wanted to do either way. But still, there are documented cases, when people talk about censoring what he does, because they don't like that he chose from lower down the list of priorities to either translate or collaborate or call to exchange to the common exchange, to the exchange experience and have readings and so on. So even he was still censored. And throughout, especially in the early stages of the Soviet Union, as far as I understand, as far as I've read the archival material, it was very crucial to disseminate literature from, disseminate communistic poetry amongst the so-called friendly republics, or in other words, the occupied territories. So it was very important to publish each other's books from between Lithuania and Latvia, for example. As long as it was communist, communists writing communist poetry, and then that was a priority, especially in the 50s. I hope I sketched an answer.
Yes. Thank you very much. Johanna, may I ask?
Yeah, go ahead. One more question.
One more question, because I have another question. Maybe I have another question, but this question is about censorship that you mentioned. Because I walked a little on Russian censorship in Vilnius in the 19th century, and I saw that censors often turned out to be not only a control authority, but also a kind of intermediary between literature and the press locally and the center of empire. That is, their task is not only to prohibit the dangerous, but also to let through the semi-dangerous, to hint to the author that it's better to first publish one text and then a more risky one, or to write a preface to the book, or what kind of bourgeois poet Eliot is, and then publish it. I mean, the censor knows some important laws and ceremonies. How it was in Latvia? It was the more repressive censorship, or more censorship like a mediator?
Thank you for the question. It's a very, very interesting question, and I'm not that good a historian to give you concrete examples, but I do know that yes, censors were real people, and the structure of the system was that there's a local organ of censorship, and then there's the higher ups in Moscow, obviously, and so you always go through the first one first, and then if necessary, you go to Moscow. The text that goes through censorship. And many times it didn't go as far as to go to Moscow. It did sometimes, but it didn't always. And so the real people, the living people who were the first instance where you sent your text before publishing, yes, some of them were actually there. Some of them were interested in protecting the authors. Some of them gave advice as to what should be omitted, what should be changed in order for the text to be publishable. Some of them were real fanatic communists who simply wanted to build the socialist revolution, or whatever the slogan was, but there's different people, and depending on who you get as a censor, the outcome could have been different. That is absolutely true. Yes, and this is shown in archival material. I've worked a bit with archival material where they have protocols of committees discussing texts that are submitted for publication, and many times it's just people arguing. People arguing about who they like and don't like, and why it should be banned or not banned, and so on. And so it's much more to do with living humans than with like I don't know, a strict system with a set of rules, because those rules were that's one of the reasons why it didn't work at all. It was supposedly a robot, but it never in practice,
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heinrich, and particularly Ivars.